Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the next session at TIE Global Summit 2020, hosted by the Hyderabad chapter. This is the world's largest entrepreneurial summit by the entrepreneurs for the entrepreneurs. And we are very happy to have you here for our next session. So, what exactly is this next session going to be about? I would just let you know. But before that, do you know we have 40,000 plus registrations for the session, 20,000 plus startups who have come in, 350 plus speakers, 500 plus one-on-one sessions that have been happening, and 135 plus leading companies participating with us. By the way, we also have some hopes that Mr. Bill Gates will come today. In fact, it is confirmed. So yes, moving on to this session that we have here, we will be talking about genomics. So this session is being conducted about genomics. This is moderated by Mr. M.S.A. Kumar and it's led by Mr. Sam Santosh. We will also be having a special quick Q&A session for you. So if you all have any questions or queries, please feel free to write it in the Q&A tab button that you can see on your screens. So let's begin with the fireside chat.
Welcome, Sam, to this TIE Global Summit.
Thank you.
A brief introduction about Sam. Sam Santosh, of course, is from God's own country, Kerala. He is a mechanical engineer from Trichy Engineering College and finished his IIM Calcutta MBA. And then, of course, as is the case those days, in 1992, he started what is called the California Software in USA. And after that, after 17 years being in the software sector, he started completely a different field in terms of starting SciGenome. I think we'll listen to him much more as we go along. So welcome, Sam, once again to this TIE Global Summit.
Thank you, MS.
Yeah. Sam, just after being in the software industry for so long, I think if I look at it from 92 to 2008, almost 17, 18, close to 2 decades, and also being in the US, what made you to change your line altogether? I mean, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. I was in the software field a little more than that because 92 I started CalSoft, but I had got into the software industry in 88, immediately after my MBA. I had gone for a job. I wanted to be an entrepreneur always. So it is a pretty long journey, nearly 20 years in the software industry. But around 2003, 2004, the Human Genome Project was completed, and it was a big effort by about 8 or 9 countries with 24 labs participating, and an 11-year project to sequence the human genome first time. So when it was completed in 2004, there is a big hype and there's a lot of noise about that. And so that got me interested into, hey, what is this genomics? I had no clue of biology or or the genome. And I started getting my interest. So I was always interested in science, and so but biology I was very little aware of. So I took a little time, actually a little more, about nearly 5 years, to start learning, starting from the basics, and getting into this, trying to understand what it is.
So
so one more thing. So that another thing that really struck me was that this is, coming from the software industry, I realized that biology was now becoming a data. You're getting data, and data is something which I am very familiar with, being in the software. And also we used to work more on what was called system level programming, working with the devices, building drivers which connects the software to the devices, so or even at the operating system level. So for me, always the source code is very important, when you work on software. So now here we are getting the source code of life. So I could sort of imagine the possibilities of what one can do now that we have deciphered or you are able to decipher the genome and get the source code.
Brilliant. What I want to learn from you is, Sam, like you came into an unrelated field and you told that it took 4 to 5 years of maybe reading through stuff and getting to know the new field what you're entering. So is this something which you'll advise young entrepreneurs, in terms of who wants to get into unrelated fields. I mean, that happens in between, you know.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a lot of time and
Takes a
effort.
lot of time
yeah.
and effort.
For me, at least my software business had grown to a particular level where I could take at least some time off, you know,
Oh,
10 or
okay.
20% time off without really affecting my day-to-day work. Otherwise, it's very difficult, especially when you're completely moving into another area
Absolutely,
and you have to start up, right? So, in my learning process, I actually went for many evening courses. You know, in a cell biology, you know, like that, to really understand.
Wonderful.
And also then go for various courses.
Yeah.
Then being the US had a lot of benefits, you know, being in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area has a lot of universities. I could also take some programs at MIT in Boston. So going to those places, you have to have the sort of the financial background and access to all these institutions, right? To get to the forefront of, you know, cutting edge technologies and learn from that.
Okay. So tell us about the genomics journey, Sam. The audience will be definitely interested. I mean, your 10-year journey almost.
Yeah, yeah. So though I started learning from 2004, 2005, I took the plunge by end of 2008, and in 2009 started the
Cochin.
Yeah, Scigenome lab in Cochin. You know, so very keen to really do something in India. So that was one of the passions, and I saw that though genomics has a lot of opportunities globally, I really wanted to see how we can do something in India, and being such a powerful technology and tool, I thought that many of the problems that we are facing in India could be fixed or at least solved to a large extent using the power of genomics. So and during that time frame, while I was picking up and learning the subject, a lot of changes happen in the industry.
Okay.
The original human genome project that I mentioned to you took about, like I said, 11 years and nearly $3 billion to sequence just one genome. Okay, it was using an old technology called Sanger sequencing, you know, based on the famous scientist Sanger, who had won 2 Nobel Prizes, and one was for this, I mean, you know, the Sanger technology. So the Sanger sequencing machine actually still works and is still standard, the gold standard, considered as a gold standard for sequencing a gene, but it is very slow, and you have to go gene by gene.
Okay.
So it took years. But like I said, with this development, many new technologies came up, and they are as a group called NGS, Next Generation Sequencing Technologies. So it was very good for me. While I was ramping up, the technologies were also coming up very nicely, and I could see every year the price falling by a big factor. Like 3 billion came down to 100 million, then it came down to 100,000. Then by the time I launched the Scigenome in 2009, the human genome cost us maybe about $20,000 a genome.
Oh, gosh.
Okay. Currently it's $500 or $400. So the next 10 years. So while sitting there and looking at that, being again from the software field, we are all familiar with the Moore's law. You know, the cost of computer cost coming down, and the processing capacity going up, and that's the famous Moore's law. And if you plot the genomics sequencing cost and the speed of sequencing a genome, it was even steeper than the Moore's law.
Okay.
Okay, so you could imagine that, hey, this is going to revolutionize many fields, you know, because of this. So coming back to the Scigenome story, so I was not really clear, okay, which is the solutions, which are the problems that we should try to address with this genomics that we have. And it was very early. So I was able to get some good advisors, good consultants in the US, and so they advised me that, hey, why don't you set up some basic skill sets first before you really think of a specific business. And to run that unit, why don't you think of some services that we can go. So when I looked in India, there is no sequencing service available. Nobody was doing DNA sequencing as a service, as a commercial service. Small labs which wanted to get sequencing done, they will ship it to Korea or to China, which are the 2 locations where sequencing was available. So Scigenome was set up as a lab that can provide the sequencing services to the outside world. Internally, I sort of dreamt of it as an incubator, which can, once it grasps the technologies well, I can then create business units on various verticals. So the sequencing technology and the informatics is considered as a horizontal, and on top of that, hey, let me see which are the verticals that I can solve.
So basically you started with an incubator.
Yes, which brings services also. An incubator unit which will doesn't need continuous pumping of money, which will run the services on the same technologies that I am interested in. Generating the data. So initially we don't have the right people here. So I invited a few of scientists from the US to come back, and Kerala was great.
That's another question I had, Sam. Like, why did you pick up Kerala? I know it's our home state.
Yeah, yeah.
But okay, those days when you started, nowadays the image of Kerala is absolutely has undergone a dramatic change for the positive. But when you started, it was not that positive. So why did you choose Kochi as a place to start your?
Yeah. Anyway, since it was going to be an incubator, and there was not that particular business, Cygenome is not going to grow into a large company. The risks were less. I mean, the location risks were less.
Okay.
Secondly, I mean, it was, even you can see it as more like a stealth mode, right? So it is a quiet place, calm place. It's a great opportunity. Secondly, when I looked here, the special economic zone was there, right here in
Correct, as you
Kakana,
said, yeah,
and they had space. They were willing to give the space to me. So it was very attractive, pretty good facilities. No outside disturbance. It's like a campus, and you could import and export. All those things are very easily done without duty and all that. So those benefits were there, because for me, in this being a new technology, all equipments had to be imported. For running the equipments, consumables has to be imported. So having a customs bonded place like the special economic zone was of great value. Secondly, though initially people were a little concerned about coming to Kerala and all that, once they came here, hey, this is even better than Bangalore right now.
Yeah.
So you have very eco-friendly.
Since you talked about people, I know you employ a lot of PhDs and all that. So what is your total staff, including your 4-5 spin-off companies? What is the total staff strength, and are you finding getting talent or talent acquisition as a relatively okay thing here?
Actually, the biotech field in general and genomics in particular is not really that much manpower intensive. So you don't like a software industry, for example. We would need thousands and thousands of people in the software industry. Here we need only maybe a few, per unit. So as far as real critical people are concerned, then you need sales staff and other than. I never got a problem in hiring people, except for some very key positions, some leadership positions, some thing which you need to attract people from outside to come back. But Indians are there, practically in every good lab in the world. You will see enough Indians and even Malayalis, so are there everywhere. So and many of them want to come back. They're looking for the right opportunity.
Great.
So mixing both these, and getting the right equation. Was not a big difficult thing. We in our 5 companies that have spun off, we employ nearly 1,000 people.
1,000 people.
But they're all different companies.
How many PhDs and how many?
Maybe about 150 PhDs, maybe about 15-20 doctors, clinicians. Clinicians. Then various other, but nobody below a master's. It will be either a master's or a PhD.
Yes, Sam, one thing I want you to reflect on is, I am not a biologist and I don't have any claims to the technology part of it, but as a common man, I would like to know from you, how does your research and the outcomes which you already have achieved, how does it benefit a common man?
Sure. So let us look at MedGenome, for example. So MedGenome focuses on diagnostics and research. So diagnostics, as we have nearly 500 tests, which look at very specific cases. This is only for people having a disease. This is not meant for there's a lot of hype about preventive genomics and wellness, what food I should eat and all that. Those are all good, but still a far away to really give you benefits. But for disease patients, and that also not for all diseases, for specific diseases where a lot of scientific progress has been done and the genes have been identified with the disease or correlated with the disease, a genetic test can give you immediate results. Typical example, India has a large problem or a big problem of genetic diseases in children. Because of consanguinity, because of old population structures. So because of this, about nearly 4 to 5% of children are born with some serious disease. This is not like later diseases like autism. I'm here talking about neurodegenerative diseases, prevents the child from walking, talking, or having epilepsy, things like that. So there's no way to solve this before genome sequencing came. With genome sequencing, now you can sequence all the sequence the genome, look at all the genes and see which gene is causing this. Also try to see from which parent you got the gene. Are both parents carrying the bad gene? And if so, how can you have a next child maybe without having this bad gene in? So a lot of benefits like that in that area. Similarly for cancer, everybody knows cancer is a genetic disease in the sense that, but it is not only about 10% are inherited genetic problems. Balance is caused by mutations that happen when your cells divide. So now we can link the genetic mutations, that means the genetic changes that has happened in your body, and connect it to your cancer and see And already science has progressed, so there are many drugs already released which are linked to specific gene mutations. So if you have lung cancer and if you have an EGFR mutation, there's a drug just for that.
Okay.
But only about 30% of the lung cancers are due to this EGFR mutation. So you know, so there is, and then also there's another problem. After a few years, you might develop resistance. But then, so it's an ongoing fight. But genetics is a powerful tool that helps you. This is in MedGenome. If you look at my second company, AgriGenome, that I spun off from SciGenome in 2016, that looks at crops and see like, hey, again the source code is the same. It's the same the same language, but different genes. So in the plants, okay, how can you make a plant better? Can you make it yield more by adding something, so changing something to the gene, or breeding it differently and making sure that the right genes are there? Or can you make it salt water resistant? You can make it drought resistant, you know. So as the environment changes and we face more and more challenges of less water, changing climate, you need these powerful tools which will, you know, food we all need, right? So how do you make more food from less area, consuming less water? How do you make the yield better? How do you make the quality better? These are the problems that AgriGenome is handling.
But on AgriGenome, it's not genetically modified crops.
No,
it's not a
that
GMO.
That is because the government doesn't allow it.
Allow that.
We can make genetically modified, but since that is allowed, we don't do that. But genetics still helps because you can reduce the trial and error. Let us say you saw two varieties of rice and you said like, oh wow, this one is good because it survives in salt water.
Yeah.
Now, but how do you get the trait in? Earlier, I mean, you are from the agriculture background, so you know you will breed and you will try thousands and thousands of varieties, and finally you might be able to get the right variety with the right trait that you wanted.
Correct.
But it's a hit and go, right? And you don't know whether the trait will stay. You know, it may be flashy in the sense that it might come in one generation, it might disappear in the next generation. You're not able to. But once you know the genes connected to that trait, now you can see that, oh, when I'm breeding, I don't need to wait for this next breed to grow the full cycle to figure out. I can just immediately look at the genes and say, oh, did my genes go through? Yeah.
Cycle time
reduces, so you're able to focus much more clearly.
This is related to the molecular biology.
Basis molecular biology. But the genome sequencing enables you to implement that.
One question on this. Okay, you started SciGenome and MediGenome has been your flagship company. Now you talked about AgriGenome. I know you have 5 spin-off companies. I mean, tell about the other 3. Quickly tell that.
Immediately a couple of years after AgriGenome, I spun off MagGenome. That is, it uses magnetic nanoparticles. Okay. And so it is related to the other companies in the sense that all the companies need to take DNA out of the material. But the material can be plant or blood or tissue or whatever material that you use. Biological material. There are many technologies available for doing that, but using this magnetic nanoparticles, you can do it faster and cheaper. So with that, company brings out kits. MagGenome. And it is based in Chennai. I mean, everything started in Cochin, but MedGenome is based in Bangalore, and AgriGenome has 2 labs, one in Hyderabad, because that's a sort of seed capital of India, and MagGenome has a lab here, but production or unit, all that is in Chennai. The next company after that was in the drug area. We wanted to see how can we make some drugs which people need here, but which are very expensive. Right. So we focused on one drug for the eye. There's a disease called AMD.
I saw
there's a drug available in the. It's called Lucentis, and a couple of other drugs are available, but they're very expensive. One injection costs about 20,000 rupees, and you need about 5 or 6 or even up to 10 injections. This typically affects old people, like 60 years, 70 years. So we wanted to come up with a better drug, or equal, at least of equal capability, or even better at maybe a fraction of the price. So that lab company has been set up in Chennai.
That is in Chennai.
It's called Saxon Life Sciences.
It
is getting to the clinical trial now. So maybe 2021 we will have the clinical trials, first phase 1. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. Let me switch tracks. I know during your expansion and these 5 companies what you mentioned, you are one of the people who have attracted a lot of outside capital from the biggies. I mean, if I say about HDFC, Sequoia, it will be very interesting for entrepreneurs to look at various series and just share that experience with us, Sam. That will be very, very valuable.
Sure.
Because nothing comes without the money support and money. So,
very true. So the biggest challenge for a startup is to get the right investment, right? So, and in the right way. Because not only that you need to get the money, it should come from people who understand what you're trying to do.
Correct.
And comes with you for the whole journey, right? Secondly, a critical question that is maybe not fully addressed all the time is the valuation, right? how much are you going to give out?
Yeah.
And how do you make sure that there is enough to give out for the whole journey,
Correct.
right? So otherwise, you'll end up maybe after 10 years or 15 years, you build up a company and you might end up earning having like 3 or 4% of the company, right?
Yeah.
Which happened to many people. Even it
Yeah.
happened to me in the software, my first innings.
Yeah.
So this being I could plan it a little differently. So that's why I incubated it. Even raising the first round, waited till the company's business model was reasonably clear, and I could start itself with a reasonable valuation when in the first round, which you call the Series A. And when you do the Series A itself, you have to have a rough idea of how this is going to play out till you either sell or get to an IPO. Right? And during the phase, it's not very difficult if you put on a table or a spreadsheet and see like, hey, okay, how much will I have to dilute over this journey roughly? And how much so should I aim for my valuation at each stage?
Okay.
Right? So that is why getting the right investor, making sure you're able to articulate your story well,
Yeah.
right? And so, being a very new field, and we being the first one in medical diagnostics here with a genome sequencing approach, the first rounds were easy. But because Sequoia,
First round was Sequoia.
I mean, second round was Sequoia. First was a close friend of mine who had a fund in Singapore.
Okay.
So Series A was him. That was only $4 million. Second one was $20 million, Series B, and that was Sequoia. But actually, Sequoia deal took only 2 weeks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they saw it and they liked it, and they moved very fast. So, but then the next one was $35 million. That took more time.
Who was that? Who was that?
HDFC and Sofina. So as you go up, people are more risk averse. So the next stage of investors.
So there is a proven performance as we go to Series 3 or Series
Exactly.
4.
There is a proven performance, so the numbers are very important.
Yeah.
Then the future path is what even more important. So what are you trying to do, right? And how are you going to do it?
Correct.
Yeah. Yes. So and being able to convince people that.
Yeah. Did it help you? I mean, okay, bringing an external funding agency, be it a private equity or a venture capitalist. I mean, did you have this experience of bringing in better governance systems and better performance management systems, or it was not that critical in your case?
Yeah, it was not that critical, honestly, in our case, because one, the gray hair, right? I mean, it's not the first company. So a lot of the systems are there, and we take it in a very professional manner. But at the same time, having an outside investor brings a little more stringency to the whole thing.
Discipline,
right? Discipline. Secondly, the connections, right?
Correct,
and somebody to bounce your ideas off and get feedback. Because we drink our Kool-Aid and you get excited every day, right?
So it's not only money at the end of the day.
No.
It is discipline, it's networking, connections. They bring it
and the advice and the mentorship.
Yeah. Okay.
And so those become very, very, very important.
Apart
And
from
the
the
value,
money.
and they are in many other companies, right?
Yeah.
So they get access to a lot of information that you don't have. So they know what is happening in China, for example. It's like Sequoia was able to, okay, what is going on in China? What is going on in Singapore? What is going on in the US? They are also investors in 23andMe, which at that time when I started was the sort of the flagship in the world.
Very good.
So you get a lot of advice and information.
Tell us, I mean, if I can ask you, how old are you now?
I am 58.
So Sam, I mean, I know you are 58. How do you keep this energy level going? And of course, all businesses have its own challenges, and we all overcome that and be successful. Tell me the secret of your energy, enthusiasm, what you show out, which will be a big thing for the entrepreneurs who wants to enter.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, enthusiasm or energy cannot be manufactured. I mean, you can't drink Kool-Aid and say like, okay, I'm going to go and do this. But so it depends on the type of people. So if you are basically an entrepreneur, you definitely will have passion and you will have some basic energy. But how do you keep it up? So that is actually a big challenge. So basically, it really depends on doing what you like to do. Like if I get up in the morning and if it's going to be work, quote unquote work, I don't want to do it, right?
Okay.
But if it is going to be fun, and if it is going to be really something which you like doing, then it's not work, right? So especially in my second innings, I mean, there's no real pressure, right? Okay, I have to go and make money, or so I have made enough, and if I could have retired, I wanted to retire, I could have retired after my software journey itself. So the ability to look at advances in science and technology and see like, hey, how can you use that to solve some problems, some challenges on a day-to-day life which can help others, and at the same time, so do good and make money, right? And which you can use again to do more interesting things. So my passion in history and science and reading and traveling, all that sort of work together to keep me going.
Very interesting, because it's not the work, it is doing what you like doing is the key thing.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I really appreciate
In
that.
fact, I remember seeing on the TV once, Charles Barkley is a very famous basketball player in the US, in the NBA. So now, I mean, he's retired, so he spends most of the time on the TV, but very good guy. And so he says, hey, you know what, when I went into basketball, I love basketball. Now I found out that people are willing to pay for it. So what more can you ask for, right?
Yeah,
Every day he'll play basketball anyway.
True,
and now he's
true.
getting paid. So same thing sort of applies to all of us. If you're able to do something which is, which is passionate to you.
I have read and seen some of your YouTube videos. One of the things which you told Sam always is that you want to use science for the benefit of mankind.
Yeah.
Okay, and your journey, what you depicted in the last 20-25 minutes, is a clear testimony to that. Let me ask you the question, what next? What are you looking at 10 years from now?
Yeah.
What you want to do, and how, I'm sure you will continue with your passion.
Sure.
But what are the next in the pipeline?
I sort of would like to do more spin-offs, but the big challenge that I came across, which I didn't address when you asked me earlier, was that the spin-off model works only if you have leaders. So for each businesses. So in India, I found a big challenge that there is not people not willing to take the effort of learning the science. So in a science company, you can't be a leader if you don't know the science, the basics reasonably well. You don't have to be a scientist, but you have to know enough to work with the scientist. So that type of leadership in India is lacking. So that's why I couldn't spin off more, not because of lack of opportunity or lack of money. Now, if I directly take up the effort and start up, then it is so difficult to hand over. So, I still don't have a good CEO for AgriGenome. I'm managing with a CEO and a couple of other people. So, very difficult to find the right leadership to take these companies forward. So, now my model is to make for the person first. If by networking, other reasons, I see a person who is willing to make a plunge, then if it matches with the business idea that I have, then I will do that. That is on the business side. But on the second side, the real passion in the last couple of years has been to develop a non-profit organization that we built up called the Cygenome Research Foundation. So the foundation has been doing good research work on the cobra genome, and so we can come up with an anti-venom without using the old method of the horse, injecting the horse. So those is an area that we are working on. I'm building up a medicinal plant garden in near Shornur. So I like to collect all the plants, medicinal plants that grow in Kerala. This is called the Hortus malabaricus, based on the book that the Dutch had made when they came here in 1670. Yeah, they collected all the details of 49 plants of medicinal plants of Kerala and made a 12-volume book. So I came across this few years back when it got translated to English and Malayalam by Professor Manilal in Calcutta University. So that's a Latin book, 300, 400 years back. So, but it's still a great book. So I am planting, trying to find every plant in that and actually physically planting them, at least a couple of them, to conserve and then conserve these, germplasms, and then provide a basis for future research people can do. So these are the things that are really, keeping me very excited.
I'm sure you will keep going for a long time. Wish you all the best. Before we hang up, one last question. Give me, not me, I mean for the people who are watching our fireside chat, to the entrepreneurs who are either established or entering, what are the 3 advices you will give?
3 advices that I'll give. Okay. First thing is that though people, and now entrepreneurship is a big thing in India, right? People are all saying, start your own. Be very careful before you jump in, is maybe my first advice, right? So that look at your risk profile, see that, because there is no pressure. I don't think there is any timing. So unless there is some grand idea that just can't wait, you should be very careful.
Don't rush into that.
Don't rush into that. Look at it very carefully, number 1. Number 2, always good to have a good founding team. Because that's a mistake I made when I started my software journey. I was on my own, and then it becomes very difficult to build up a team and grow. So always having a good founding team with different skill sets will be a good thing to have. Number 3 will be, we touched upon briefly, the funding. So how do you attract the right funding? How do you make sure? My thumb rule is that at least for the first 5 years, you and your team should hold 51% of the equity. So don't get diluted beyond that. My golden rule. So this would be, I would say, the 3 most important things for an entrepreneur.
Great. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Sam. It was a very interesting talk.
We have a brief discussion out here about Kerala, the business scenario in Kerala, and then we are also looking at manufacturing and what's happening in Kerala right now, and what's the future outlook, etc. We have with us Mr. Balagopal. Mr. Balagopal is a veteran entrepreneur. He's now a writer. He spends a lot of time on boards of companies and he travels as well. Our discussion largely we want to compare what's happening in India today and focus a lot more onto the economics in Kerala, which are the sectors which are seeing exciting trends and growths, and also to bust a few myths about the state and some of those popular perceptions, if I may. And it'll be a discussion where we have some questions. We have some slides coming on. So some of the data that we talk and we present will also be there on the screen for you to parallelly see and understand. So Balasan, it's been a very interesting time right now. There is a lot of changes happening around the globe, primarily because of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic had really started in India, and if we just look at India right now, there were signs of a minor deceleration of growth. So, what are your thoughts on what was happening pre-pandemic, and then what is really happened today, what's happening now?
Thank you, Rajesh. The pandemic has focused so much attention both within the country as well as globally on this huge disruptive phenomenon that I think we have all taken our eyes off the ball as to what was happening on the economy. And even when we discuss the economy, we are now discussing what is the impact of the pandemic on the economy and how to mitigate that impact and how to come out of that. So not only in India but across the world, the focus has now shifted to how to enable the economies of various countries through active fiscal and monetary policies and other interventions to recover. That is the stress. But I think this makes us forget that economic trends are long-term things, and so what we are seeing in India and the pandemic today should not take our attention away from something which was happening for many years before that. And one of those things which you alluded to is the fact that the Indian economy was slowing down. So an economy which 10 years ago was seen as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, over the last few years has been slowing down, lost its position as the fastest growing economy, has been overtaken by other economies. That is something which we are losing sight of because everybody has now got one factor which we can hold responsible for poor economic outcomes, which is the pandemic. So that's the first point which I want to say. So it is very interesting that if you remember a few weeks ago, there was a feature in the newspapers where an IMF report was cited, which stated that Bangladesh was on the verge of overtaking India in per capita GDP. Now this is very significant piece of information because 4 years ago Bangladesh's per capita GDP was 40% lower than India's, and in just 4 years this economy, a country which was considered a basket case not too long ago, is today going to overtake India. So that's one. The second very important fact is that among South Asian countries, India, once Bangladesh overtakes us, we will slip to number 4 position among the South Asian countries in per capita GDP income. So this is not very flattering for a country which 10 years ago was thought of itself as being a potential rival to China, as another among the emerging nations, a potential emerging superpower. So why I mentioned this is the IMF report very interestingly implicates India's poor HDI as the factor which is imposing limits on our growth. So this is something which has never come into discussion. We have always discussed only that how to attract overseas investment, how to attract foreign direct investment. And so the whole thing was to look at investment-led growth. And we were ignoring signals which were coming, warnings which were being given to us by extremely wise and outstanding economists like Amartya Sen, Jean Drèze, and Ashoka Mehta and Kaushik Basu and so many others have been telling us over the years that India is neglecting human development indices at our own peril, and that these are going to come up and set the limits to our growth, and that is what is happening today. So in this context, suddenly the one state, a small state, which is 1% of the area of India, 2.5% of the population of India, 4% of the GDP of India, and generally considered to be an outsider and an outlier, Kerala. Suddenly Kerala comes into prominence because in all these reports by all these economists, this state is held to be the honorable exception in India for having paid enough attention to the social factor, to the human factor, and to have ensured that the social capital which we need to invest in, on which economic growth has to be built, will be done. So I think the time of Kerala is really coming in a very interesting way because of all these because of these exogenous factors which are turning out to be provide shocks to the economic system.
And I think HDI, when we talk about Kerala, a lot of people knew about HDI, and probably everybody spoke about it also. And if you see the data that we have on slide 4, and which shows you some parameters related to literacy, infant mortality, etc. Kerala also always had higher. But a very interesting data point here is the multidimensional poverty, which shows a very large difference in the rest of India and Kerala. So what are your thoughts on that?
And I'm glad you raised this point, Rajesh, because see, when we discuss economic development in India, and both in the media as well as in business circles, our tendency is to concentrate on some headline numbers like GDP rate of growth. And what is very interesting is, even on GDP rate of growth, say 30 years ago or 40 years ago, Kerala was a laggard. But now not only has Kerala caught up, but Kerala has gone ahead of the pack, and today it is among the leaders in the per capita GDP stakes in India, with the highest per capita GDP income. Once you factor in remittances also as part of the net state domestic product, which is only correct, because it is earned by Keralites working abroad who are remitting it back to their homes. It is being spent in Kerala, so why on earth should it not be accounted in Kerala's net state domestic product? So that's just an accounting convention that invisibles are accounted only once in national income accounting. So hence it fails to be captured. That is one point. The second point is, there is a narrative about Kerala as if we are a kind of like the sick man of India, and we are being propped up by remittances. So in fact, even Malayalis refer sometimes derogatorily to Kerala as the money order economy. That is, it's the economy which depends on remittances. Now, even this is not entirely correct, because if you look at the data, about 8 years ago, inward remittances reached, 8 or 10 years ago, it reached a peak when it was 24% of net state domestic product was accounted for by remittances. After that, it has been steadily declining, and last year, 2019, it has dropped to 14% of GDP. Now, what is very interesting here, Rajesh, is that while the remittance as a percentage of the net state domestic product has been declining and has declined to 14% of net state domestic product, in absolute value terms, it has not declined. In absolute value terms, remittance is continuing to increase, which means what? which means the net state domestic product of Kerala has been increasing faster than remittances. That's what it means. So that is accounted for by the other sectors of the Kerala economy, which are the primary production sectors like agriculture, industry, and like the services sector. So I'm not getting into the division of all that there. So this is something which we seem to lose sight of, that the productive sectors of the Kerala economy have been growing faster, and this narrative has exaggerated the role of remittances in the Kerala economy, and that actually unnoticed by most of us, including unfortunately policy makers, the productive sectors of the Kerala economy have been growing very satisfactorily over the last few years. That's the real story. And I just want to also remember one point which you mentioned. See, the success of China today, the most outstanding success of China, which they say in the last 30 years, is that at no time in human history have so many people been brought out of poverty in such a short time. What China has achieved. So China's achievement is really not the bullet trains and the great cities and the transportation network which they have created and Shenzhen. That's not the achievement. The great achievement of China is that it has brought more people out of poverty than any other society in such a short period of time. And the great achievement of Kerala is also that in the period when, in the last 30-40 years, Kerala has almost wiped out multi-dimensional poverty in this state, where the figures show that 27.9% of Indians suffer from multi-dimensional poverty. The percentage for Kerala is only 1.1%. Now that's an amazing achievement. And this was brought out in a recent paper by Dr. K.P. Kannan and a co-author, where they were studying remittances. So this is an absolutely astounding figure, and where the per capita income also is mentioned as something in the region of $3,290 which puts us at the entry point of the middle income economies of the world, whereas India's average per capita GDP is $1,799. So I'm unable to understand how we are not seeing the fact. 2-3 things. One is that Kerala is not a laggard. On the contrary, all the figures show that this has been one of the best performing states on the economic development. Number one. Number two, we are the best performing in terms of removal of poverty. And I think the most interesting thing is that the base has been created by our attention which this state paid to human capital some time back, which will bring us to the, I think, where we are now jointly, Rajesh and I, we presented a paper at the Center for Development Studies. I'll leave it to Rajesh to introduce that subject, and we'll go on to that in the next part of our discussion.
So, I think looking at Kerala more in detail, and one of the longest journeys in your life, perhaps for 3 decades, has been running an enterprise in Kerala. And you would have seen the Kerala business ecosystem fairly up close and personal. What has been your experiences of running a business in India, in Kerala?
So the narrative in Kerala has been that this is a state with militant trade unions. It's a highly politicized state. It is a state with, if you look at it from a factor markets perspective of setting up industry, for setting up any industry you need 3 factors of production: capital, labor and land. So now, Kerala is supposed to have constraints in all 3, and it is so it's not a great place. So that's the view. And when you add to this fact that all the 3 major factors of production are already constrained, and you add to it militant trade unionism, you are adding a narrative that this cannot be a very attractive place for industry. Now, in such a setup, when I started my business, you can say conditions were not propitious, etc. But without going into that story in great detail, what started as a small startup with 50 people and a very modest investment, when I sold the company less than 10 years ago to a Japanese multinational, it was the world's largest maker of high technology blood bag systems, employing 1,400 people in one factory. And so I was thinking, now if this place was, in retrospect, when I used to participate in seminars and discussions, and I used to think, how can that narrative be correct? Because then how was I able to succeed? And I knew I did not have any extraordinary capabilities or resources. And then how did I succeed? Then trying to find the answer to that question, I started looking at others. And then I found, more and more names of companies which had started as startups like mine around the same time in the 80s and had grown organically and grown to scale and doing outstandingly well, started coming to my attention. And that's when we started our together. And now so far we've unearthed 50, actually we got more than 50 companies. We've selected 50 companies for this study. And they include, what is most interesting is, we have excluded IT, we have excluded tourism, we have excluded the traditional manufacturing sector, we have only taken high-tech manufacturing. And in that we have found 50 companies which have done outstandingly well. And the very interesting thing is, they span so many other domains. So, to come back to your question about my experience, at the micro level, I think in any discussion about industrialization and industrial policy, we cannot remain at the macro level and talk in aggregates and secondary data alone. We have to dive into the micro level and find out, why did a company like Terumo Penpal succeed? How did a company like this succeed? How did a company like SFO Technologies succeed? How did a company like PK Steels succeed? How were they able to grow to national and global scale and excellence and continue to perform strongly for years at a stretch with a CAGR which would be an enviable rate of growth for industry anywhere in the world? And how were they able to do that in a place which had a reputation for not being an easy place to do business in? In fact, the irony of it is, even today, a few weeks ago, just probably a couple of days after the IMF report on India's backwardness in economic development, came a ease of doing business study which was commissioned by the Niti Aayog, which ranked Kerala at the bottom. So I remember there was a lot of concern, and many people were saying, see, Kerala is such a, and I remember I had some on social media, I reacted to that saying that, yes, it is ironic that the state which is rated as #1 in ease of doing business, in 2 days later, in the same newspapers, was rated last as the lowest literacy in India is Andhra Pradesh. I was astonished to learn. The lowest literacy rate in India is Andhra Pradesh, which 2 days earlier they had announced had the #1 in the ease of doing business. I'm not saying there's any connection between the two, but they seem to be meaningless measures, which I think you need far more meaningful measures, metrics like multi-dimensional poverty and not just a poverty line based on calorific value. And you need, say for instance, economic development. We must look at not just economic growth in terms of the, how GDP has been growing. So if we go into a nuanced understanding of this, so based on my experience and the anecdotal experience of others like me with whom I have shared my experience and who have managed to build large organizations from small beginnings in Kerala, I think there is a story which everybody seems to have missed, which is that for MSMEs, Kerala is a damn good place. And then that led us to our investigations about why is that so? What could those factors be?
So to add to what Balasan mentioned, so we have the names of a few companies who are doing exceedingly well in Kerala and in various diverse sectors, mostly manufacturing, and all of them are manufacturing. So we have one of the best steel castings units in India in PK Steels and Kozhikode. The largest electronics goods exporter in India, SFO Technologies. The largest dental implants maker in Asia perhaps today, Dentcare. Largest in vitro diagnostics maker in India, Agape Diagnostics. Largest condom manufacturer in the world, HLL Lifecare. Largest blood bag maker in the world, Thermo Penpal. The largest kids/infants garments maker, Kitex. And largest, and in the world they are the largest oleoresin manufacturer, which is Synthite. So some very interesting companies in Kerala. And I'll move on to some of those themes that we have seen, and when we did our study on these companies. Bala sir, if you could comment on some of those broad themes that we saw, some of those common points that we saw across these 50 companies.
Some of the common features which we found about these 50 companies, and I was interested to find that they actually were very strongly resonated with me, because that was exactly what I also did. Almost all these companies started as startups. They started with very low capital investment. They were not set up in government industrial estates or with receiving any special concession from government. Mostly these were family owned enterprises, probably started on some land near their hometown, which is why many of these companies are located at places like Muvatupuzha, Pattimattam, Kizhakkambalam, Puliyarakonam, which are, none of these are large industrial cities or towns or anything, they are far away. So, another common characteristic of all these companies is they all employed high technology. They required high skill, and they all employed high technology. That was very interesting, which meant, and it did not therefore surprise me to find that these MSMEs, even when they were very small, of course now some of them are no longer small, some of them are already in the 1,000 crore, 2,000 crore bracket, most of them are over 200, 300 crore size. But even when they were small, say in the 10, 20 crore bracket, they were already investing money in R&D. Now this was something which Indian private sector never did. And one of the failures of the Indian private sector was that we never invested in R&D. We wanted technology from abroad. We focused more on the know-how and not on the know-why. We did not develop any industrial process of our own. Our patent filings were extremely low, almost non-existent. But for instance, my company, I'll tell you, a small company like mine with only a infinitesimally small R&D budget, we had 15 international patent filings. Now I'm sure if you check up with Synthite, if you check up with PK Steels, if you check up with SFO Technologies, and if you check up with companies like that, you will find there will be a strong intellectual property rights activity there. There will be an office, part of their department, just looking after that, because that's the new thing about. So these are companies which were all very strongly technology based, process based, and not ones which were too, say, very heavy on marketing and the other dimensions of management. Not that they didn't. So in that sense, I would say they were very similar to the South Korean and Japanese and Taiwanese companies. Their stress was more on making a damn good product, making it well, and putting all their limited resources into R&D and making the products better. So that was another very interesting feature of this. And they grew organically. They kept growing organically. And the very interesting part of it is because their business kept growing, if you look at their trajectory, it is a steady growth. It is not a sudden growth and then a plateauing. All these companies, I don't think a single year passed without them where they did not fail to record a 15% CAGR. Not a single year passed. So these were the common characteristics. And as I mentioned, one more feature of them was that they focused on R&D. Now that's very interesting. All these companies went around hunting for R&D resources. They found people working in national labs. They found people who had retired from national labs, and they went and requested them to come and lead this young team of theirs. So here was a completely different approach to business, where the stress was not on somehow getting the order, going and standing in front of a government department with a petition, but they never wasted time on all that. They sat in their labs, in their shop floor, factory floor, spent all their attention there, worked on their products and processes till they became masters of it. And that is what is common factor running through all these companies is that.
That brings us to, I think, one of those aspirations that you have mentioned many times is if any part of India can become an industrial setup like Taiwan, it's probably Kerala. Will you elaborate on that?
Yes.
That entire.
Thank you. That is my. Whenever I say this in meetings and seminars, I notice some broad smiles on the faces of most people. People start thinking, am I talking about Kerala? How could I be saying this about Kerala? But I mean it very sincerely. See, let me just say this. As economists and as the IMF has recently pointed out, India is going to be hampered in its quest to become an industrial and economic power because of the criminal neglect of the social sector and the human development indices. We today have not reached HDI levels which the East Asian tigers reached in 1990. 30 years ago, where Taiwan and South Korea and China had reached, India today has not reached. That's the first fact. Now look at the second fact. This small state in India, Kerala, has achieved a level which is higher than any East Asian tiger has achieved in literacy, human development indices, any parameter which you take, we are far ahead. Kerala is not only ahead of China in all HDI, Kerala is ahead of any province of China. There is not a single province of China which has performed as well as Kerala has done. So my point is, I don't think our administrators and businessmen today in Kerala have any excuse for failure now. There's absolutely none. The necessary conditions for economic growth exist. So high HDI, then look at the second part. Why do we say, as we are finding, that for MSMEs Kerala is very good? What does MSME need? MSMEs need urban environment. You need urban facilities to be available. Now, where are urban facilities available in most of India? Only in the big cities. Kerala has an urbanization rate which has crossed 50%, the only state in India. But what is interesting about Kerala's urbanization is it's a dispersed urbanization. It is not concentrated in one large mega city. We have 7 cities with a population of more than 1.5 million population. We have hundreds of towns, taluk level towns, etc., which are 50,000 to 100,000 population. And all of them have colleges, schools, infrastructure, housing, all are connected by good roads, very good motorable roads, and they have excellent connectivity, they have railway stations and all the other essentials. So that's the second. Third is, Kerala is the only state which provided for public provision of public goods, where, which meant that we had an inclusive policy that no section of the population was left out, no one left behind. So every section had access to school, college, had access to public health, etc., which has again become evident in the recent times. We have good transportation, last mile connectivity, we have dispersed industry and residential areas, good governance. For the last 4 years, Kerala has been rated by a non-partisan think tank in Bangalore, the Public Affairs Center, and Niti Aayog together in their rating, the number one state among the large states, the number one state for good governance for the last 4 years running has been Kerala. So we have good governance also. And we have an effective dispute resolution mechanism which will ensure that it will step in whenever companies have any problems between trade unions and if at all there is any such issue, we have a good dispute resolution mechanism also at work. And last but not least, I think one very important factor is during a time when divisive factors are rearing the head, and we are threatening to lose many of the great qualities which made India as a great country, which is a very inclusive country. Kerala is a microcosm of India. We have had a syncretic history. We have had ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, even linguistic diversity. Malayalam has absorbed so many influences from so many different languages like Tamil, from Sanskrit, from Arabic, from Persian. We have absorbed all these influences. So what is today the Kerala culture is a syncretic culture. And I think we truly are positioned to be, say for instance, I feel Mumbai missed the bus. Bombay was a great international city, rivaling Shanghai at one time, 50, 75 years ago. Today, Bombay is in danger of becoming a Maharashtrian city. Whereas Kerala can become the international face, like Kerala can become, this state can truly become like the international trade zone, free trade zone sort of for the whole of India. I see that as a great possibility because of the fact that I think foreigners would love to come to this place because they can get along, they see similar things in the landscape, they see a tolerant people, they see harmony, social harmony here. They find that there is no poverty, no wretched poverty of the guy. People are proud, they stand up for their rights. So I think we have everything which it takes. And the success of MSMEs and industry here shows that we can do it. It is not just a theoretical possibility, Rajesh. The beauty of the study which we are doing is, we are studying companies which actually did it here. And therefore, the fact that we did it here shows that what we are talking about is not just something hypothetical, but it's something very real. And this is what gave great satisfaction to people, to outstanding economists like Amartya Sen and Jean Dries, when they said that Kerala reassures them that economic theory is right. Thank you.
On that high note, we're open to questions now.
This was led by Mr. Balagopal Chandrasekhar, also known as Bala amongst his colleagues, and moderated by Mr. Rajesh Nair. Thank you so much, Mr. Bala, for being with us over here. And I would like to hand it over to you, Rajesh. Please take it forward, Mr. Rajesh.
Thanks for the patient listening. And so what we had broadly presented during these two sessions, one on genomics and one on manufacturing, is largely focusing on these sectors in Kerala. The last section on manufacturing was largely the inputs and the broad summary of a paper that we presented. And those of you who are interested, do feel free to reach out to us through the TIE office, and or in case you have questions. Since we are running short of time, we'll pass on to the next session. But happy to pick up any questions. Some of you have SMS questions as well, so some of these questions we'll answer offline. Thank you, Jasleen. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nair. We would now like to conclude this session. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us here today. Thanks to all our eminent guests for being with us and having this wonderful fireside chat sessions. Thanks to all the viewers for joining us at the session at TIE Global Summit 2020. See you in another session. Thank you.